Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Aliza Jafri, and I welcome you to another episode of the CSSPR webinar series, in which we aim to bring to you quality discussions on a host of security, strategic, and foreign policy issues. South Africa's decision to dismantle its surreptitious nuclear weapons program continues to be cited as the only example of a voluntary nuclear rollback. However, policymakers and academics only look at it as a momentous event in the annals of nuclear history. Analyses of the nuclear order and its ongoing erosion include no mentions of South Africa, as they are primarily focused on nuclear competitions among Beijing, Washington, and Moscow. However, prominent scholars in Andrew Footer, Ludovica Castelli, Cameron Hunter, Olamide Samuel, Francisca Silvestri, and Benjamin Zala's have brought South Africa and other non-nuclear weapon states back into the discourse on nuclear weapons. In a recently published book entitled The Global Third Nuclear Age, Clashing Visions for a New Era in International Politics. As the title suggests, the book attempts to provide a truly global perspective on nuclear politics with a view to moving beyond what the authors call Western ethnocentrism. They argue that without engaging with actors and stakeholders beyond the 9 nuclear-armed countries, it is difficult to accurately assess how technological change, geopolitics, and the weakening of norms on key nuclear constructs can be discussed. To discuss this excellent and timely scholarly work, we are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Ludovica Castelli, who is one of the authors. Dr. Ludovica Castelli is project manager of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. In this role, she manages the program's activities within the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium and leads research on non-proliferation and disarmament. She's currently a PhD at the University of Leicester, where she was part of the ERC-funded Third Nuclear Age project and is due to her research interests include historical international relations, particularly conceptual history, Middle Eastern nuclear politics, and US nuclear proliferation discourse. Ludovica has presented her work at numerous academic and track 2 venues across the US, the Middle East, and Europe, and published her research in academic journals, policy papers, and commentaries. He's also a co author of the book, which we'll talk about, The Global Third Nuclear Age. Thank you so much, Dr. Ludovica, for joining me on the podcast. It is a pleasure. I have been following yours and your group's work for quite a while, and it is intriguing, provocative, and refreshing. I would like to begin by asking this fundamental question, which has two parts. One being, what is the logical argument behind seeing nuclear policies, doctrines, and related issues through the age phenomenon? One, and when we look at the third nuclear age, the first thing that comes to mind is the set of emerging and disruptive technologies. Is there a lot more to it? Because there are norms, there are other elements that one has to add to the mix when we talk about this new nuclear age. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me here. Back to your first question. So basically, the book makes these two central arguments, and the first one is a definitional one. So we're entering what we call the principal investigator of this project, Andrew Footer, has defined the third nuclear age, which is a distinct and qualitatively new chapter in global nuclear history. So basically, this phase is marked by this fundamental transformation in the nature of nuclear politics. where these long-standing assumptions about proliferation, deterrence, arms control, global governance no longer hold in the same way they did during first the Cold War and second in the immediate post-Cold War period. So during the Cold War, we had the so-called first nuclear age, which is said to have existed between 1945 and 1990. And the gravest concern here was major nuclear war between the two superpowers. And then after 1990, after 1991, the focus shifted to the threats posed by non-state actors and rogue states, and that defined what was then termed as second nuclear age. So in this book, we basically try to capture some sort of change. We try to capture how different countries in different part of the world, in different areas of the world, are adapting or not adapting, are reacting or not reacting to a different set of changes. We argue that, of course, this sort of adaptation and these different reactions are not experienced uniformly. So, of course, I mean, it will be shaped by a multiplicity of actors, perspectives, capacities, and different states, depending on, of course, their histories, perceptions, and also memory, are pursuing divergent pathways to nuclear security and influence. And this diversity, of course, complicates the efforts to restore a whole set of concepts like strategic stability, arms control, disarmament, and it challenges also the traditional binaries that have underpinning nuclear thinking for decades. The way but especially I mean, the group that at the project, the way we defined the elements we identified are basically three. And of course, I mean, I have to say this is not, of course, exhaustive. This is not exhaustive analysis. It's just the elements that we deem to be, that we consider more significant, more relevant, to try to capture how these countries are moving, are thinking. The first is technological change, which is not just nuclear modernization, but it's also the development and diffusion of strategic non-nuclear weapons. So talking about hypersonics, missile defense, advanced cyber capabilities, technologies that are blurring the lines between nuclear and conventional warfare and are opening up new pathways for, of course, crisis escalation and even inadvertent nuclear use. The second is geopolitical shift, which is towards multipolarity. So the era of uncontested US nuclear primacy and unipolarity is giving a way to a renewed great power competition involving not just the United States, but also Russia, China, increasingly India, and other regional powers. This is fragmenting the global nuclear order into competing blocks and driving states to kind of reevaluate alliances, reevaluating partnerships, and increasingly diversifying all of their partnerships to gain as much as they can from them. And then the third element is the normative sort of dislocation. So the institutional architecture that of the global nuclear order, the so-called global nuclear order that was historically centered on the NPT, is under considerable strain, and that's of course a fact, and that's been a fact for a while. There's the breakdown of arms control agreements. There's the deepening rift between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear armed states. The emergence of alternative frameworks like the TPNW. And these elements all reflect a growing divergence in how states imagine the future of nuclear governance. And there's also a growing disconnect between those who see disarmament as a moral and legal imperative and those who view nuclear weapons as essential to the national security. And I mean, what we're seeing today in the European context is, of course, this dynamic is very, very manifest and evident. Yeah, so I'll stop here and
I had to ask, thank you. I had to ask this question later, but since you brought this up in your answer, I would put it right here. We have often heard that the salience of nuclear weapons is increasing, but if your book is anything to go by, um, it suggests that this idea that the salience is increasing is not uniform across the groups of countries that you have brought to the table. So that brings me to what you refer to as the activists and the protesters in your book, the group comprising Austria, South Africa, and Kazakhstan. Um, and you also mentioned the erosion of the NPT-based nuclear non-proliferation regime. So how do you bring all these components together and conceptualize the role of activists and protesters in the evolving nuclear landscape? Because I think this lies at the heart of this is one of the distinguishing features of your book, in my opinion.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the activists and protesters group basically reflects a broad coalition of states that are mostly non-nuclear and outside, extended deterrence relationship states. And these are states that are increasingly frustrated with the direction of the global nuclear order. While diverse in their politics or agenda, they're united by the concern over the normalization of nuclear deterrence and the growing risks of nuclear use. Many of these states are influential middle powers or regional leaders, like Brazil, South Africa, as you mentioned, even Indonesia. And their voices are amplified through coalitions, like, for example, the Non-Aligned Movement, historically, the New Agenda Coalition, Nuclear Weapons Free Zones, for instance. They've also developed closer ties with civil society groups, NGOs, creating a transnational push to delegitimize nuclear weapons. So basically the goals are twofold: to reduce the risks posed by existing nuclear arsenals and to push for disarmament, while also at the same time defending the right to access nuclear technologies for peaceful purposes. Many of these demands align with the original spirit of the NPT, which promised disarmament, non-proliferation, and the right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But from their perspective, the nuclear armed states haven't lived up to their side of the bargain. So they're even here, I mean, we can see, and I think it's also an interesting thing that comes up in the book. There are, of course, internal divisions. So some states like Austria and New Zealand, they reject nuclear technologies altogether. While others like Brazil and Kazakhstan, they defend access to nuclear power for development or strategic autonomy. Some see the nuclear order as unfairly Western dominated. Others use the growing multipolarity of global politics to assert more independent positions. And these diverging interests sometimes make this pathway less coherent than others. But what binds them together is a shared sense of injustice, which is both historical and contemporary, ongoing. Their influence is growing. Though they can really force disarmament, they have contributed to a discursive shift in global nuclear politics. So the CPNW is one example of this impact. It is one fact that it can be ignored is that it is ignored by nuclear powers, but it has influenced public debates in some societies and challenged the moral legitimacy of nuclear weapons. I think that this group, the activists and protesters, this group matters because they challenge basically the foundations of the existing nuclear order. They're holding nuclear armed states to account and pressuring them to engage with global security concerns beyond great power politics. So in the third nuclear age, that pressure could shape, even just from a discursive perspective, but it can shape the future of disarmament and potentially open space for more inclusive non-nuclear pathways to security.
Thank you so much. This was quite comprehensive, and I think you make an important point regarding the discursive shift in the debate around nuclear weapons as a result of the emergence of the ban treaty. Um, uh, but there are two things here, and as you know, Middle East is one of your areas of expertise. The situation in the Middle East has, on the one hand, vindicated these activists and protesters, but on the other, that very milieu has created more demand for nuclear deterrence. So these activists and protesters will have to take these um, destabilizing and subversive happenings into account as they prepare their next onslaught against the nuclear haves and the Western Bloc. But I think this framing will really be helpful for both policymakers and academicians who work in this space. Um, I had to ask this question on methodology first up, but because you talked about salience, I am asking this now. Um, while the perspectives of the elites have garnered some attention in the literature regarding nuclear weapons proliferation and elsewhere, but uh, elite perspectives are not really at the center stage of the debate on nuclear weapons or around nuclear weapons. What made you look at all these three criteria through an elite vantage point? Because I think that's really important. The leadership variable and how leaders think about questions related to multipolarity, technological change, and norms, whatever you make of them, are really important.
Yeah, so I mean, also a methodological choice, the fact to focus on elite perspectives. We basically conducted interviews with independent experts, but also officials when it was possible, and in parallel, we relied on basically official statements and white papers and official strategies that are available and that can as much as possible show the strategy, at least on paper, of each of these countries. So the assumption here is that when it comes to the security policies, and especially when it comes to unconventional nuclear and conventional weapons, the choice is made at an elite level. So it was really a methodological choice to focus on that. One caveat is that of course, I mean, some of the choices that pertain to nuclear weapons are secret, or I mean they're they're not something we can 100% know about. So there are a lot of question marks. There are a lot of there can be hypotheses, and there can, we can, some trace and map out and trace some sort of a continuum or some sort of a trend in what a country, what a government does, what an administration does. But of course, there's still question marks about the current nuclear strategies, the current nuclear tactics of some countries.
Yes, I think as I mentioned in my introduction, South Africa's case is right is right before us when it comes to having a secretive nuclear weapons program. But obviously, academicians and scholars can only do so much to navigate that problem, and we need to rely on the opening up of archives, and historians can then do their work years down the line, decades and years down the line. And the story keeps on changing, as you know. Uh, what we knew about the South African nuclear program or the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years ago is different to what we know now. So that's how history changes changes the arc every now and then. Um, so I think your framing of hedgers and balancers is quite interesting, but um, the countries that you've lumped in that particular group, uh, they are, at least two of them in India and China, are actively modernizing their nuclear weapons programs and conventional weapons programs too, and they have also made their choices very clear with regard to what they want to do in their foreign as part of their foreign policies. Um, so how do you look at that, the grouping of the hedgers and balancers? Iran, now things might be different. Now hedging might not necessarily be the right approach for Iran. How do you look at that framing?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, I guess I should have said this at the beginning, but I mean, this is a book that is vulnerable to time. So, I mean, these categories are not set in stone. These dynamics are very volatile, and policies change, due to many factors. So, I mean, this again, I mean, one country that is in one category in a year could be in another category. I think our idea here on how to identify each country in a specific category was that of some sort of, a prioritization. So, I mean, if you're, if we've put Iran, Germany, India, UK, and China in the edges and balances, but that doesn't mean that, of course, there's not an element of nuclear weapons, for instance, or if there's at all no discourse about, disarmament or, I mean, there could be, but in some countries, I mean, it doesn't mean there's no narrative, no disarmament narrative at all. So there's a lot of overlapping between the categories. I think the idea was that of saying, yes, I mean, this, according to what we know now and what has been in the situation that it's been in the past, this country identifies as, a hedger more than a traditionalist. But of course, I mean, again, things are very fluid and they can change. The edges and balances group basically is defined by a clear strategic direction, and less by a clear strategic direction and more by ambiguity and pragmatism. So as I said, there's Iran, Germany, India, and the UK and China. They aren't fully committed to disarmament, to transforming their security through advance the nuclear technologies or to expanding their nuclear arsenals dramatically. They're cautiously navigating a complex and evolving nuclear landscape, often by hedging their bets and balancing competing pressures. Each country in this group is responding to the actions of others. So China's build-up, for instance, is influenced by US military advantages and regional transformations. The UK's and Germany's positions are shaped by Russia's aggression and the growing influence of Russia in Europe. India somehow walks this fine line between deterring Pakistan and maintaining historic ties with non-aligned states. So that was a little bit the analysis. And on the other side, Iran appears to be inching towards nuclear latency, maintaining this option of building weapons without fully committing to doing so. Again, I mean, this is the country that more than the others could change its policy, again, because of actions of others that have shaped internal decision making. So, I mean, we'll see if Iran. It'll be interesting to see if Iran, stays as a hedger in a short time or moves into another category. But again, I mean, edging takes different forms. I mean, as I said, Germany relies on NATO and hosts US nuclear weapons, while at the same time it boosts its own military. The UK is modestly modernizing its deterrent and the alliance structures, and we've seen this with the latest news about the F-35s. India and China are both enhancing strategic conventional capabilities like hypersonic weapons and missile defense. And at the same time, they maintain relatively restrained nuclear postures. Iran is investing a lot in asymmetric tools. It has been doing asymmetric warfare for a while. Drones, missiles are, they're one of their best tools to deter regional threats. But crucially, the most important thing is that none of these states see nuclear weapons as the dominant pillar of their security strategy as of today, and as of when the book was written. And they don't appear interested in deploying tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use, which is something that happens with instead nuclear traditionalists. And also another element is that most of these countries continue to support the idea of disarmament, at least in public. And none of them are engaging with initiatives like, the TPNW in a structured and meaningful way. So again, I mean, what makes this group significant is that their posture may shape the global nuclear environment by demonstrating alternatives to both disarmament and aggressive nuclear expansion, and that of course is what could happen with Iran. It could become a virtual nuclear capability, or it could become an overt a nuclear state. Same thing with UK and Germany. I mean, they reflect the constrained space for Western middle powers, who are now more reactive than proactive, perhaps. And this is something that happens in Europe a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we could also use the term fence sitters here, if you will. There are some of these countries are sitting on the fence. Iran, as for Iran, you talked about the axis of resistance, the forward defense strategy, the axis of resistance, and the ballistic missiles. But over the past year or so, we have seen both of those being eroded. So the Iranians' faith in nuclear diplomacy and reliance on the nuclear option in whatever form and manifestation uh, is changing. Um, um, you've written about the attacks on nuclear facilities and what Iran underwent in June also will have a direct bearing on how the Iranian elite, especially the theocratic elite, looks at the nuclear option in the months and years to come. So yeah, fence sitting um, could also be a good a term that we could use here. Um, and obviously, you've done some good work on the the WMD free zones in the Middle East, and because since 1995 that has been an integral part of the NPT process, I think the prospect of establishing one has attenuated significantly due to this 12-day war between among Iran, US, and Israel. Um, my so I have my last two questions, and those pertain to like so three of the most important elements of the conventionally understood Western nuclear order are norms against nuclear testing, extended deterrence, and um, non-proliferation. So the faith in security assurances as well as extended deterrence is reducing. Uh, you talk about the technological transformers, and in that group there is South Korea, which, according to you, and obviously it relies on conventional weapons and all. How much do you think um, countries like South Korea, who are under the extended deterrence framework, will be pushed towards going nuclear in this day and age?
Well, first of all, just to give a little bit of context to the definition. So the technological transformers are basically this group of states. We included Taiwan, South Korea, Israel, Japan, and Australia, that are leaning heavily into advanced conventional military technology as their primary way to deter nuclear armed adversaries. So rather than building nuclear weapons or hosting them, these countries are investing a lot in what we call strategic non-nuclear capabilities. Things like, long-range precision missiles, missile defense systems, AI-enabled platforms, drones, and so on and so forth. In the case of Australia, for example, we're talking about conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. Talking about AUKUS, for example. So the idea is that these states are transforming at different speeds and for different reasons. Taiwan is building up denial capabilities to hold off the Chinese invasion. South Korea focuses on preemptive and counter leadership strategies against North Korea. So what unites them isn't just tech. It's a shared belief that preparing for a conventional interstate conflict is now essential in a world where nuclear threats still loom large. So to coming back at your question about South Korea, even if the South Korea chapter was made by a brilliant scholar, Cameron Hunter, was the best when talking about East Asia and Asia in general. So yeah, so I mean, I'm always a lot very cautious when at making predictions or forecasting. And ironically, my PhD thesis was about how the nuclear domino metaphor kind of shapes our understanding of how proliferation works in a way that is kind of just wrong, or at least it is just not how these things work. So I'm very cautious at saying that South Korea will get closer to a choice of developing a nuclear military program in the next decades, just like I'm very cautious about Iran. I mean, we can make hypotheses, and in the South Korea case, of course, there was Cameron Hunter talked about the discourse that the South Korean officials have been making for a while. The narrative about getting nuclear weapons, which we can of course also see has some sort of leverage and securitization narrative when it comes to getting attention from the main ally, which is the US, and of course sending a message to also North Korea. Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to this rhetoric, these narratives, of course, there's always an audience or a different set of audiences that to whom this narrative is directed. But I mean, I will just stay away from forecasting any sort of proliferation trends, which is, I mean, either in the Middle East or East Asia.
Oh, I understand forecasting is not that easy, especially in a very convoluted global geopolitical environment. Uh, but we are living in testing and trying times where geopolitics is again being ruptured by the return of the use of force as an instrument of politics. So that has to be taken into, and this is why I believe that your inclusion of the geopolitical angle in your methodology is very important and worth engaging with. So my absolute last question, you at the very beginning of the book, you talk about the the fundamental notions of the current you know nuclear debate, like strategic stability, arms control, and all that. Arms control uh, is fast eroding. As I said, extended deterrence is also not uh, is not that credible. It was Extended deterrence can only do so much as far as maintaining credibility is concerned. You obviously, one can go back to Charles de Gaulle saying that famous, Washington for Paris and all that decoupling thing. But there is strategic stability is one thing that is often thrown around. The concept is thrown around everywhere, especially in the by the Western audience. Um, Most of your work um, around the third nuclear age delves into strategic non-nuclear weapons. Um, so just give me a sense of the strategic non-nuclear weapons and how could they contribute to reshaping our understanding of the the conventional notion of strategic stability. Because I think, as you rightly say in the introduction state of the book, we need to move beyond Western constructs surrounding nuclear issues.
Yeah. And that's one of the core aims of this book is exactly, to break out of this traditional Western-centered lens that has dominated nuclear thinking for decades. So I mean, yeah. The notion, of course, of strategic non-nuclear weapons, as I said before, is particularly important because it is part of the first element that we defined as, one of the three pillars that we identified as something that, of course, is a driving change, something that is driving change, especially with some specific countries that are more receptive for specific reasons to technological change. And we talked about the technological transformers, so all these countries that are prioritizing advanced conventional capabilities, which again go from hypersonics, missile defense, AI, quantum, and all this so-called emerging tech. So yeah, talking about how
EDTs, EDTs have a fancy ring to it.
yeah. Yeah, so not just modernization, but also, the increasing progress, technological progress, and development on new and advanced weapons system that, of course, create some sort of vicious circle, right? Because you have one country getting something that is more advanced, and then there's others trying, adversaries trying to catch up as they can. And if you put another element here in between these trends, that is the erosion of the non-proliferation regime, or even worse, the erosion of the whole arms control and non-proliferation architecture that has always tried to, put some limits in how these countries, compete and try to catch up with each other. Then, of course, that's the recipe of something that could go simply wrong. And that's how we kind of define the challenge of strategic nuclear weapons. The erosion of the of the non-proliferation and the arms control architecture was one of the main thing that came up when we first discussed the main elements of this third nuclear age, because it's just a fact, some sort of a trend that has been going on for now 2 decades at least, and we do have oops. Sorry. So we do have now this unfortunate combination of, rise of new technologies and military doctrines that also complicates verification and enforcement. And we have geopolitical tensions and great power rivalry. We have conflicts. We have a conflict in Europe that is still going on and shaping, drastically and dramatically how security policy is understood, and how security is conceived from a government level in Europe. From it's quite manifest. And then we have a conflict in the Middle East that is now kind of in its it's not quite active in its passive, if we can call it like that, phase, but it's still something that
It is
can
it is actively passive.
yeah,
Yeah.
something that um, could be active again in a matter of days. If something happens, and we've hearing the rhetoric of military action and force and coercion, and that's just just a discourse and narrative that doesn't benefit the non-proliferation regime, which is already, of course, in a state of in a very negative and negative state. So this is a little bit the state of the the state of the global nuclear order, if we can call it that.
Or the global nuclear disorder.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
thank you so much, Dr. Ludovica, for joining me on the podcast. I believe uh, the things that you have put on the table are thought provoking, and they um, lie at the heart of our discussions on nuclear issues as and when they relate to geopolitics, because we can't divorce the two. Um, I well, like the non-proliferation regime is fast eroding, and I believe um, with arms control not being in good shape at all, I think there is merit to what Dr. Ulrich Kuhn and Heather Williams call behavioral arms control. I think when it comes to EDTs, behavioral arms control should be given a chance to succeed. I thank you once again, and I look forward to having more discussions with you going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.